He had broken every army Rome had ever sent against him. He had crossed rivers no Roman general dared, invaded islands at the edge of the known world, and turned the Roman Republic itself into a ruin. The men who followed Gaius Julius Caesar had marched 20,000 miles. They had never learned how to lose. And now, they were the prey. Not on a Gallic plain. Not against a foreign king. Inside a marble palace, in a city of 1,000,000 hostile souls, they were surrounded. The soldiers around them wore Roman armor, carried Roman weapons, and marched in Roman formation. The men coming to kill them were Romans. The water in the wells had turned to salt. They had nowhere to go. What happens when the undisputed master of the world steps into a golden cage of his own making? At first, the royal palace of Alexandria offered the quiet luxury of kings, concealing the whispers of a eunuch's betrayal. But beyond the towering walls, a labyrinthine city of 1,000,000 hostile souls was rapidly closing its jaws around the Roman conqueror. Suddenly, the streets choked with 20,000 heavily armed phantoms, Roman-trained soldiers marching to slaughter their former master. Trapped behind makeshift marble barricades, Caesar listens to the deafening silence of his veterans drawing their blades in the dark. Will the predator survive this labyrinth, or will the conqueror of the world bleed out on the mosaic of a foreign palace? The architecture of isolation. Alexandria was laid out on a grid, its intersecting lines drawn centuries ago by dinocrates. The avenues were wide, the alleys narrow. The royal palace occupied the promontory of Lachias, a city within a city containing gardens, temples, and barracks where the walls rose 60 feet. Beyond those walls, the trap snapped shut. The geopolitical reality of Alexandria tightened around the Roman commander. He established his headquarters within the sprawling, opulent confines of the Basileia. He secured the royal palace complex and the adjacent public theater to form a rudimentary defensive perimeter. Pothinus the eunuch, the boy king's chief minister, walked through the shadowed colonnade in white linen that swept over the mosaics. He had spent weeks inside Caesar's perimeter, eating at Caesar's tables, making suggestions about Egypt's creditors. He had watched Cleopatra inhabit the rooms of the palace she had been smuggled into in a bedroll. While ostensibly hosting Caesar within the palace, Pothinus smiled by day and secretly dispatched messengers by night to the garrison at Pelusium. Achilles received the orders and marched on the capital. He led a highly organized, professional Ptolemaic army of 20,000 heavy infantry and 2,000 cavalry. These were not undisciplined levies. At their core were the Gabiniani. They had come to Egypt 6 years ago, under Aulus Gabinius, the Roman general who marched Ptolemy XII back onto his throne. When Gabinius left, some of his soldiers stayed. They had remained, taken local wives, integrated into the Ptolemaic military apparatus, and forgotten the Senate. Historical accounts, notably Caesar's own De Bello Civili, emphasize the treacherous nature of these troops. They are portrayed as soldiers who had gone native, abandoned Roman virtue, and been corrupted by the decadence of Alexandria. However, modern historical analysis suggests a more complex, terrifying reality. The Gabiniani, possessed the rigorous tactical discipline of the Roman war machine. It was now fused with an intimate knowledge of the local terrain, and bolstered by an overwhelming numerical superiority of nearly 5-1. They remembered the drill. They marched under the eagle standards, wearing chainmail and carrying the gladius. The dust from their marching boots blocked the horizon. Alongside them marched hardened mercenaries from across the Mediterranean, outlaws, and the elite royal guards of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Against this overwhelming tide, a ratio of nearly 5-1, Caesar's men have only their unyielding psychological resilience, forged through a decade of continuous warfare. The tactical imbalance was staggering. Suddenly, the conqueror of the world was trapped in a labyrinthine city of nearly 1 million hostile souls. The Bruttian district was the royal quarter, filled with grand Hellenistic architecture, monumental statues, and sweeping colonnades. It had become a beautifully sculpted prison. Within the palace, scouts reported the movement. The veterans of the 10th Legion, interspersed among Caesar's forces, heard the numbers. They had broken the Republic at Pharsalus. They were now the prey. The conquerors were caged within the luxury of kings. A labyrinth of marble and thirst. The illusion of Roman invulnerability shattered. There was no open field. Caesar's traditional mastery of sweeping cavalry maneuvers, and the devastating legionary charge, was entirely nullified. The dense, vertical maze of high-rise blocks and narrow, intersecting corridors erased every advantage. Recognizing the existential threat in October 48 BC, Caesar acted with ruthlessly pragmatic speed. The palace gates were sealed. He ordered his weary veterans to tear down the ornamental masonry of the city. Legionaries dragged marble benches across thresholds and toppled statues of the deified Ptolemies. The heavy stone crashed onto the pavement. The fragments formed massive barricades across every street, connecting the precinct to the wider metropolis. They blocked the street entrances with the debris of a 300-year-old dynasty. Soldiers wedged timber beams against the rubble and established watch fires that stained the ceiling frescoes with smoke. Caesar placed his cohorts in the streets. This is how the Bellum Civil records it. Simply, in the third person, as a tactical decision among tactical decisions. He placed cohorts at the intersections. He had new fortifications constructed. He extended his defensive lines. Achilles arrived in the city. He did not ask for parley. He seized the intersections. The Gabiniani locked shields and advanced down the Canopic Way. They carried Roman pila. They wore Roman mail. They were the mirror image of Caesar's own doom. The Gabinians occupied the limestone houses surrounding the palace complex. The siege began. The conflict degenerated into a grueling, suffocating struggle. Cassius Dio perfectly captured the nature of this urban warfare, describing combat that shifted relentlessly from house to house. It became a matter of angles and confined spaces. Caesar's veterans are forced to fight for every atrium, doorway, and stairwell. The Egyptians threw javelins from flat rooftops, the iron points shattering against Roman shields. Legionaries locked their scuta together, forming the testudo, moving through open squares while arrows deflected off curved wood. Roman veterans, accustomed to fighting under the open sky on the wide plains of Gaul, now found themselves in a different world. They were thrusting their gladi into the darkness of private atriums. They battled for inches of ground in flooded cellars, defending heavily fortified doorways against unending waves of Egyptian assaults. No one shouted. The Romans fought in total silence. It was the mechanical rhythm of men who viewed slaughter as a trade. Blood coated the mosaic floors. The geometry of the battle was absolute. Achilles threw thousands of men into the choke points. The choke points held. The pile of bodies grew. Within these beleaguered walls, Caesar harbored a deadly internal threat. He held the young king Ptolemy XIII and his chief minister, the eunuch Pothinus, as hostages under the guise of royal guests. Pothinus, whose calculating betrayal had already orchestrated the death of Pompey, now directed his venom toward Caesar. Smiling at his Roman captors by day, Pothinus secretly smuggled messages out to Achilles by night. These messages carried tactical intelligence directly to the besieging army. The tension inside the palace reached a breaking point. A courier carrying a letter from Pothinus to Achilles was arrested at a corridor junction in the palace. He was seized by one of Caesar's men, who had been told to watch for exactly this kind of traffic. Caesar unfolded the papyrus. He read the handwriting of Pothinus. The internal betrayal was absolute. The retribution was swift and merciless. Caesar did not order an execution in the public square. He did not deliver a speech on treason. He ordered 2 legionaries to walk to Pothinus' quarters. They opened the door. The regent looked up from his ledger. The legionaries drew their swords. The door closed. The ledger was left unfinished. Pothinus was executed, his severed head serving as a grim warning to the boy king, yet the walls of the palace continued to close in. Yet, the resistance merely shifted shape. Princess Arsinoe IV seized a moment of distraction, slipped through the Roman cordon, and escaped the palace to rally the opposition. The Roman conqueror has eliminated an enemy within, only to birth a royal figurehead for the forces arrayed against him. Stripped of their internal spy, the Egyptians shifted to psychological warfare and elemental terror. Pothinus, before his demise, had understood the vulnerability of the fortress, its reliance on subterranean cisterns fed by the Nile. Following his earlier designs, Egyptian engineers descended into the tunnels, carrying heavy wooden wheels to assemble water lifters in the dark. They severed the subterranean aqueducts that fed fresh water into the Bruttian district. They broke the clay barriers, separating fresh water from the sea. They operated treadmills to pump the Mediterranean tide directly into the Roman reservoirs. Within the palace, a legionary lowered a wooden bucket into the central well. He hauled it up, the water appearing clear, and took a drink. The brine burned his throat. He vomited onto the stones. The centurions tested the other wells. The results were identical. The Mediterranean had invaded the drinking stores. The water from the palace fountains had turned foul. They were trapped behind barricades. The sea was in front of them. A hostile army was behind them. Now, the earth below them was turning against them. For a brief, terrifying moment, the famed discipline of Caesar's legions wavered. Men who had survived 100 battles fell to their knees. Caesar walked to the center of the courtyard. He reminded them that the gods had not abandoned them, arguing that sweet water could naturally be found on any coast, if one simply dug deep enough. He pointed to the earth and ordered them to dig. The men used their entrenching tools. Dolabres struck the limestone foundation, iron sparking against rock. They dug through the night, sweat dripping into the soil. At dawn, shovels hit a layer of wet clay. The aquifers beneath the city had not been breached. Fresh water pooled in muddy pits. Soldiers scooped it up with their helmets and drank. The siege held the great harbor. As November approached, the tactical situation reached a critical threshold. To break the siege, Caesar needed reinforcements from the sea, but his survival depended entirely on maintaining a fragile lifeline. It was their only hope for reinforcement and resupply. Achilles recognized this failure to starve them out and shifted his assault. He moved to seize the great harbor and the Heptastadion, the massive causeway connecting the mainland to the island of Pharos. 72 Roman vessels sat empty. If the Gabiniani captured the ships, the blockade would be absolute. Achilles marched his men toward the docks, forming lines on the wooden piers. Caesar anticipated the maneuver, ordering his cohorts out of the palace to charge down the narrow streets leading to the water. The two forces clashed on the wharves. It was a terrifying collision of identical training. Roman armor ground against Roman armor. Short swords sought gaps in the mail. A Gabinian soldier thrust his blade. The Roman parried, stepped forward, and drove his gladius upward into the Gabinian's throat. Blood sprayed across planks. The dying man fell, turning the sea pink. The narrow gangways choked the movement until men fought shoulder to shoulder. The dead could not fall. They were held upright by the press of the crowd. Caesar saw the numbers massing in the city. The Egyptians were deploying fresh reinforcements from the outer districts. The Roman lines were thinning. The fragility of the conqueror. The events of late 48 BC fundamentally dismantled the myth of Roman invulnerability in foreign terrain. Trapped in a golden cage of Hellenistic marble, the master of the Roman world was reduced to the status of a desperate survivor. This crisis exposed a critical vulnerability in the architecture of absolute power. The Roman forces survived not through brilliant strategic envelopment. They endured through the grim, mechanical resilience of a few thousand men, forced to hold a line against an entire kingdom. The Gabiniani were a reflection of Rome's own martial heritage turned against it. They demonstrated the fluid, often uncontrollable nature of military loyalty in the Mediterranean basin. Within the walls, the veterans polished their armor, maintaining the routine of the camp. They treated alabaster halls like muddy fields, digging latrines in ornamental gardens. They butchered their remaining pack animals on mosaic floors, piling the bones neatly in the corners. Caesar sat in his quarters. He opened a map of the eastern provinces, placing small stones on the parchment to represent legions weeks away. He calculated the distance from Pergamum and measured sea routes from Syria. He did not look at the smoke, nor did he listen to the chants of the Egyptian army. He dipped his reed pen and began to draft a new order. The scratch against the papyrus was the only sound in the room. The ink dried slowly in the night air. The cisterns were repaired. The water ran clean again.